Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. Another weekend perspective as we, I did a show last weekend, and we talked a little bit about, and it felt a little bit like a funeral, I guess, the way I framed it. But basically, we've kind of gotten to the end of what I called Cloud 1.0. Kind of speculated about why it felt like we were kind of at the end of an era, at least an aspect of the end of an era. And I kind of felt like I left it open-ended as to like, well, okay, that's fine. Like, it's one thing to sort of call an end to something, but like what might the future look like? Because, looking back at the past is useful, and it can be, help us historically, but like it doesn't necessarily help us figure out what's going on in the future. And the future is oftentimes what matters the most when we think about technology, because we're trying to figure out what to do next. So I thought what I would do is I put together 10 questions about what Cloud 2.0 might look like. And part of this is, kind of an evaluation of where we are, as of, January 2026, with, sort of the end of what I'll call the end of Cloud 1.0. And then also, do we expect certain things to kind of come out of 2.0, into 2.0 based on, some lessons learned, some new behaviors that we're seeing, obviously some technologies that are going on and so forth. So we kind of want to dive into those sort of 10 things and would love to get your feedback on, what we missed, what things we have a blind spot for, what you're expecting over the next few years in terms of cloud, where you see shifts happening and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to start with the first one. This was me sort of saying, what didn't Cloud 1.0 achieve from kind of the original grand vision, right? So the original grand vision was kind of unlimited scalability, very, very granular billing, so only pay for what you use. So all of that unused resource that was going on in IT, we're not going to have that anymore. We're going to have global reach. At some point, all applications will be in the cloud, and we'll start having kind of this sort of common development model that is far easier to use. Costs are going to constantly come down because as more and more people are using the cloud's able to deliver resources cheaper, and ultimately, kind of reduced complexity because certain things are just taken care of for you. And, in all fairness to sort of Cloud 1.0 and the AWSs and the Azures and the Googles of the world and many others, we achieved a lot of those things. Public cloud achieved a lot of those things. We were able to basically put an API on an infrastructure, and we were able to do things far faster. We were able to scale things without really thinking about them. We were able to have global reach. For a while, costs were coming down on a regular basis. That didn't necessarily happen forever, but we did see that sort of happen. And ultimately, we saw a lot of behaviors that were commonplace in the cloud, foundational in the cloud, started to even making their way back into like private cloud and so forth. So, we saw the expansion of automation. We saw self-service capabilities. We saw, expectations change about how to, deliver services on demand at scale in an automated way, in ways that you could scale up and down. We started to see, some financial capabilities and awareness and so forth kind of being built into systems. We saw some of the capabilities that sort of originated in the cloud, then became open source projects and eventually made their way into the enterprise. So, think about like containers and Kubernetes and other stuff like that. So, we did see a lot of stuff. But what we didn't necessarily see, and I guess, these are sort of open-ended grades. I don't know, like give them a failing grade, but they're kind of open-ended. We didn't necessarily get to fully granular billing, right? We still have lots of capabilities in cloud that people feel like, are wasted resources, are very difficult to understand the billing. We don't see the sort of, serverless everywhere where, you still have to manage a lot of things, whether it's, access list or NAT tables or IAM or all sorts of things. So it's a different way of doing IT. It's still a very complicated way of doing things, right? And so forth. So we don't have all of the applications in the cloud for various reasons. Like we haven't completely gotten rid of the complexity of what IT organizations look like. So there are still many capabilities that aren't fully realized or never really kind of got fully realized. That it'll be interesting to see if they sort of materialize. And the reason I bring that up first and foremost is, if we've learned anything over the last 15 years in the Cloudcast, is that, I sort of call it Gracely's theorem, which is, there aren't a lot of necessarily new ideas, but there are a lot of kind of re-implementations of things when certain stuff changes. And so I always sort of say, when CPU capabilities expand and when network bandwidth expands, right? So when CPUs become a lot cheaper or when network bandwidth expands, a lot of things that were difficult to do in a previous era or with the previous implementation, now become, viable. And, those two characteristics might not necessarily be the two that do this, but I think we do see a lot of, kind of reiteration, rehydration of ideas that maybe didn't work out because the previous version, wasn't economically viable or the technology wasn't fast enough, it wasn't yet cheap enough. We didn't know how to manage it at scale, whatever it might be. But oftentimes people eventually figure that stuff out and it comes back around again. So I'm not sort of putting a grade. I mean, I think if we put a grade on cloud, cloud gets an A. It did all sorts of things. It changed behaviors. It unlocked business opportunities that previously had been locked behind slowness and complexity and other stuff. So for that, but still, potentially a long way to go for a number of things. The second question I had is what seemed promising, but might not have been, might have been the wrong timing. And the two I had on this list that sort of jumped out at me immediately. The first one was serverless, sort of the concept of serverless. And I think, I highlight this because when serverless first came out and again, it was originally sort of primarily AWS Lambda, but there was kind of a whole ecosystem that kind of is spawned out of serverless. Aaron and I were the first to jump on that and be like, this really feels like a big step change for cloud because it kind of delivered at least a validation of kind of everything that we wanted in cloud, which was like completely on demand. You didn't have to hardly touch anything. So much complexity kind of felt like it got hidden in the background or got abstracted or became invisible. Super granular billing. People were really able to think in terms of like, this is a business process. I want this to be exactly like how the technology works. I don't want to have to think about all kinds of stuff like scalability and server load balancers and blah, blah, blah. And it feel like it made progress in that space. And then it kind of, as we often see with many things that are portrayed as silver bullets, there's a reason that it can look like a silver bullet. And there's also a reason why the limitations eventually sort of come out. And every technology at some point has some limitations. And then it really becomes a matter of like, do people press through those limitations? Are they able to change the behavior so that the limitations are really no longer in the view? And serverless, accomplished parts of that, but it didn't necessarily push through. And I feel like, the possibilities of what serverless gave us a glimpse into could vastly be expanded in sort of a broader sense of things. So we'll see if Cloud 2.0 takes that in a bigger, broader direction. And the second one, and I'll kind of touch on this maybe a couple of times. The idea of sort of expanding the public cloud out into other places that aren't the centralized public cloud. So whether it was, an outpost or a region, we saw aspects of this, which was like, I want the goodness of the public cloud, but I want it in the place where I need it, not necessarily in an Amazon data center or in an Amazon region, but I need it in my data center, or I need it someplace that's somewhat mobile so that I can take it, on a moving vehicle or whatever it was. And we saw this and there were implementations of it. They sort of fell short in terms of, something was missing. It didn't have enough of the services. It couldn't handle certain failure scenarios. So like if it wasn't, the control plane connected back to the main cloud, and if that was severed or, wasn't there, it couldn't operate autonomously. It didn't exactly work the way the other one did. It might have been too complicated or made too many assumptions about what you might have available on your local environment as opposed to the public cloud. So I do feel like, especially as we're seeing, more and more requests around things like digital sovereignty, that concept might kind of reinvigorate itself in some other form factor, some other implementation that will be interesting to sort of explore. So those are a couple of things that jumped out at me that were promising, but might have been the wrong timing at the time. Third thing I had on my list is why didn't, for as big as the big clouds have gotten, so whether it's, again, AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, whatever, why didn't more SaaS applications get bundled into the hyperscalers? We went through a whole period of time in which For example, every time there was an AWS reInvent, you were always like, oh man, what company that's on the show floor is going to basically go out of business because Amazon's going to decide to turn that into a service. And, if we think about SaaS, the same people that are buying public cloud are in many cases buying so many of these SaaS services, whether it's a CRM or, a collaboration tool or whatever that thing might be. And I'm just sort of surprised that we didn't see a vastly broader SaaS acquisition strategy by these cloud providers to sort of, really lock customers in, really find ways to sort of get 1+1=3 as far as how it's delivered. And I think they got very happy and profitable letting the SaaS applications run on top of them. But I'm kind of surprised that we didn't see a bigger consolidation. And so right now what we have is, we have these sort of hyperscaler clouds, but for the most part, like they don't own massive application portfolios. They own massive infrastructure portfolios. And I think the more we get into what AI can possibly do, it'll be very interesting to see if that lack of experience running, building, expanding application portfolios kind of comes back to bite them or sort of leaves them exposed somewhat as people start to build new behaviors around what AI is possible. And again, that might totally fall apart because those, there's lots of talk that, the sort of the SaaS paradigm and how SaaS works is going to get rewritten by AI being able to build these things or build them faster or build them more capable. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the direction that the cloud providers will end up taking is doing that. But they haven't necessarily shown a proclivity for being able to, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of the, well, hey, Workday's running on top of your cloud. You should be learning a lot about what they do. But right now, all you're doing is sort of managing like CPUs they consume, or, with EC2 instances. So I think that'll be very, very interesting to see how much, as AI comes along, how much they expand from really being infrastructure providers of some sort to having much more of a robust portfolio that's part of their actual service versus just running on top of them. Fourth thing I had on my list is, we go back 10 years, we go back 15 years, it was an AWS-centric world. And, we've said over time, that probably isn't going to continue forever. There will be competition, and there was competition, right? We see today, we see Google growing quite a bit, still growing 30 or 40% on obviously smaller numbers. We're seeing Azure growing, AWS still continues to grow. But, even as I mentioned in the previous, kind of Cloud 1.0 show or, last week, we are seeing, even AWS admit, hey, there needs to be easier ways for you to interact with multiple clouds. We've seen Google try and do this in the past. We've seen Azure do it. So it will be very interesting to sort of see, does multi-cloud become simpler to do? Whether that's on-prem to public cloud, as I sort of talked about, sort of these extensions of clouds, will it be easier to kind of do things that have to involve multiple clouds? And that might be, there's a technology transition happening and people who used to trust, say, AWS, now trust Google with more new things, and they've got to interconnect them. It could be that one of them decides to create a pricing war and really just try and undercut the other ones and try and, drive business their way, as we've seen in the past. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to watch because I think the reality of multi-cloud is prevalent in the industry. How that kind of manifests itself, people have different opinions about stuff and implementations are different. But I think it'll be interesting to see if the cloud providers sort of move from being really, really defensive as like nothing else exists except for my cloud to, my customers are expecting more reach. How do I enable that so that my stickiness, kind of extends to, where their trust boundaries are and so forth. So I think that'll be interesting to watch. All right, question number 5. And Brandon Wichert and I have talked about this quite a bit. I mean, right now, primitives are kind of the core offering for the majority of what the cloud providers offer. And that's not 100% true. There are some applications and some constructs that they do that are bundled and other things. But for the most part, primitives, database, compute, storage, networking, security, firewalls, all those sort of primitives are the offering. And what that means is that while the cloud providers sort of have everything, sort of like going to a Home Depot, you can buy anything if you want to build it yourself. it'll be very interesting, as we're seeing more and more with AI, and the expectation with AI is that, I just get something that just works and I start getting results as quickly as possible. Do we start to see more integrated offerings dominate the landscape? So I think that'll be very, very interesting to watch is, has the last 10 years, 15 years really been, the equivalent of like, older folks being like, well, I used to compile my own Linux, or we used to compile stuff directly for hardware, but we don't have to do anything for that anymore. Like there's abstractions that make that simpler, or, like, do we start to see higher level, more bundled, more integrated abstractions in cloud than we've seen over the last 10, 15 years? I think that'll be really interesting to watch. Second, I guess number 6 I've got on my list is sort of kind of goes hand in hand with that is if, as they, as the cloud providers in particular, but this could even be relevant to, enterprise customers and so forth, as they build out their AI investment, which is, as we know, huge data center investments, very dense, complicated data center environments, whether it's power and cooling or whatever. But especially for the cloud providers, like, do we start to see them evacuating or getting rid of a bunch of their existing primitives, maybe the ones that are like, not as popular, they don't need 7 flavors of this or 25 flavors of this, just in order to make room for these new AI capabilities, right? Do they start to go, well, I've got a bunch of things I've got to build out for the cloud, that are going to be AI only, but do they start to look at their existing data centers, footprints, regions, colos, whatever, and start to say, gosh, I gotta get rid of half of what's in there? And does that trigger some sort of new type of technology around that, whether it's consolidation technology or just a slimming or a reducing of their current catalog on the non-AI side in order to make room for that sort of stuff? So I think that'll be very interesting because that'll obviously have some ramifications for people that are dependent upon certain things that might be a little more fringe than that are, completely mainstream and so forth. The next thing I had, number 7 on my list, is, something that I feel like every cloud talks about, but people still run into problems all the time, and they've gotten a little better, is security going to be on by default? Right? We live in a world now in which, we're obviously seeing more and more threats. Unfortunately, hackers are taking advantage of AI. We're seeing things like, Linux is becoming, an interesting technology again, in terms of like, can we build sort of zero CVE or secure by default or zero trust environments? Because, companies are just really struggling with, how do I keep up with that stuff? And I feel like, especially coming from the primitive side of things, yes, there are certain things that if you do them all right, you can create secure environments. But we're 15 years into this. There are things like AI that can help us. Do we start to take a mindset of sort of secure by default? Yes, that might restrict certain things, but at the same time, I think people are going to start clamoring again for, how can I keep up with the attackers constantly coming after me? And whether it's ransomware or whether it's fakes or whether it's, whatever it might be, I feel like they're gonna constantly clamor for more security capabilities, faster security capabilities. So do we start to see a on by default behavior that starts to emerge, or some sort of paradigm start to emerge? Number 8 on my list, do we start to see, we're already starting to see sort of a lot of discussion going on again. We're at January 2026, and things can change in the world, but it does very much feel like, especially if you're listening to any of the World Economic Forum speeches that are going on this week from heads of states from all over the world, it does feel like they're very much sort of looking at the world order and being like, I don't know that it's going to continue exactly the same way that it has over the last 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, whatever it might be. And they're kind of questioning what sort of privacy, what sort of sovereignty does that mean for our technologies? So whether it's on a country level, on a company level, international corporation level, we're seeing more and more discussion about things like digital sovereignty, not just be discussions, but kind of become mandated requirements. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see, do we see more and more of this? And obviously, this sort of leads to the idea of, the outpost types of capabilities. But, do we see, completely disconnected things? Do we see the ability to, essentially drop off the idea of like a factory, but that factory is in the right country, disconnected the right way from, the regions that they don't want to connect to anymore? I think it'll be very interesting to see which cloud providers, which vendors, which communities really kind of rally around, just responding to what's going on in the world, whether you like it or not. It's going to have implications about how companies operate, how countries operate, how partnerships operate, that will likely just be different than exactly what we have today, and how different it is, we'll see. But that sovereignty piece of it, that privacy piece of it, probably just becomes escalated, elevated and escalated. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. On number 9 on my list, and the last two are sort of AI related. The first one is, what are the new AI capabilities that nobody's even thought of, right? Like, if you ask people right now, it's like, yes, I can get a chatbot, I can get a model as a service, I can get GPU as a service, I can get coding assistance, I can I can start to build agents, and I can start to manage agents. But what are the things that we never thought about? 10, 15 years, database as a service was a concept that people were like, wait a second, you're going to automate away a DBA? Like that's an incredibly important thing. It's like, no, I can just turn it into software. Or serverless is a concept. We hadn't thought of anything like that. Or, time clocks that sync on a global basis to be able to do things, or just autoscalers that auto-scale across these 10 or 11 parameters. Before it was always, so the cloud gave us a whole bunch of things that we just never really had thought of. Just even the concept of like, hey, infrastructure at the other end of an API was a completely foreign concept. So it'll be really interesting to see what new AI capabilities beyond just the building blocks of models, chatbots, developer assistants, agents, we start to see emerge, and start to happen. I think that's going to be obviously very, very fascinating to see. And then the last piece is, as these AI things emerge, whether they are those building blocks that we talked about or whether they're sort of new capabilities, how does that mix of workloads get distributed across clouds, right? Like, what are going to be the characteristics? We often see, technology tends to kind of go from centralized to decentralized and centralized to decentralized, and sort of it ebbs and flows back and forth because, where it operates has its pros, it has its cons, it impacts latency, it impacts capacity, it impacts scalability, it impacts the economics of stuff, use cases change, people's behavior changes, business behaviors change. I think it'll be really, really interesting to sort of see what the mix of AI workloads look like and where they get distributed. Do we see, GPUs become less of a centralized resource and start to get distributed more? Do the cost of GPUs come down so that happens? Do we see models getting close to the data? Do we see data moving in ways that, models have to adjust to or agents have to adjust to? I think there's all sorts of patterns that we don't yet know what they're going to look like that I think is going to have a big impact on, what the future of these clouds are going to look like, right? They may not look exactly like the sort of highly centralized, regionally clustered thing that we see. We'll probably see a lot of that, but it'll be interesting to see what AI does to sort of change that, because so much of it has to do with, where data is, where the resources and GPU resources are, what the economics of putting it in one place versus another, and how do the use cases, potentially evolve around that. So anyways, 10 questions about what Cloud 2.0 might look like. Would love your feedback about where you think we miss things, where we have a blind spot, where totally misreading something, and maybe just, hey, you need to look a few more years into the future because there's this next big thing coming. Let us know what that is. You can hit us up on social. All of our socials are on their show notes. So hope that was interesting to you, and we'll keep kind of digging into what Cloud 2.0 might look like in the next couple of years. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.